Good afternoon. 'Twas the present politics before Christmas, and quite a few things have stirred. Round Tynwald Quays and Legislative Council as the Christmas hiatus neared. Yes, the powers that be across the water continue to consider whether the bill for leaving the band of EU nations should be 40 billions or 50 billions or whatever. The latest royal has charmed her way into action with a refreshing enthusiasm for both her prince and the job she's chosen. And the Manx government is getting on with business, but not quite as usual. Those Paradise Papers. And there's evidence that the Panorama programme and the newspaper articles after did have an effect on this island, as it is viewed by business across the channel. But while we wait and see, this island tries to come to terms with a slimming down of its income, and cuts seem necessary to put this island on a balanced footing. Head of that list at the moment, I suppose, in populist terms, Meals on Wheels. But we are apparently seeing a rolling programme of gas protests as well that are continuing. The pensions conundrum is still to come to a rest. Can pensioners in the future expect putting yet more in for a less return? And we have a resignation from the Lib Van Party. Well, that's just touching the surface. Let's meet our guests. And first of all, David Cretney MLC came from the corporation originally, St George's Ward, into a long and distinguished Keys career, including ministerial terms at tourism and leisure as was, trade and industry as was, community culture and leisure, infrastructure, and chair of the post office. Elected and re-elected 7 times before going upstairs to Legco in 2015. Are you, just out of curiosity, looking to stay on after 2020, Mr.
No,
Gray?
I'm not. The purpose I went to, or one of the principal purposes I went to Legislative Council, was to assist the House of Keys in trying to get some democratic reform up there. I've long wanted to see reform. There's not been the appetite previously in the Keys. I'm pleased there is now, and hopefully we can see some progress.
Well, certainly the debate is on about Lord Lisvane. We'll talk about that later on. Chris Thomas, the Policy and Reform Minister, good afternoon to you. Stood in 2011, stood again when unsuccessful then in a by-election in 2013 in Douglas West. He's now the Douglas Central member. And Alison Lynch, Marown Commissioners, 22% are over 60, so issues affecting the whole island will affect quite a few, I think, of those 22% in particular. But it's the issue of planning that you see as top of your list, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And that's something that is basically not only planning, I suppose, but also freedom of information, which is coming along in the new year as well.
Yeah.
That could put quite a strain on your officers.
Well, we of course use a part-time clerk whom we share with another local authority to try and keep costs down. And yes, it will put strain on our clerk.
Will you have to appoint another official to take care of it?
I'm hoping.
I suppose you don't know how much is coming in yet.
Well, we don't seem to think it will have a massive effect on us. We're totally transparent anyway. People can come and view minutes from meetings. They can come along to the public sessions. There's not a lot that's controversial in Marown, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, as far as we know at the moment.
Yeah.
We'll wait and see. The Chief Minister launched a robust defence of the Isle of Man against what he described as a deliberately orchestrated attack from the international media. This followed off the Paradise Papers and the programme on Panorama and the article in The Guardian and various other places. He told Tynwald the Manx government would not be complacent when the island's integrity was challenged and was determined to create an island of enterprise and opportunity, displaying high levels of international cooperation. In the nervous days after the Paradise Papers, the government did have some good news, of course. He was able to address Tynwald colleagues not long ago with that good news.
We will continue this engagement to help us ensure the debate is balanced, based on fact, and that our hard-won reputation for international compliance and transparency remains front and centre. And, honourable members, it is not only us saying how compliant the Isle of Man is. Last week, the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes published its latest ratings following the start of its second round of reviews. The Isle of Man has retained its top compliant rating. This makes us one of only 6 countries to be awarded the top compliant rating during the second round of reviews, and we are currently only one of 3 to have been rated compliant in the first and second rounds of reviews.
That's good news, Chris Thomas. How good news, though? Can the Isle of Man say, yes, that's really put us up amongst the angels? Of course, there's this list coming out, black and white lists shortly. Or does it mean a great deal?
No, we are very good at transferring information on request and automatically in some situations. It was a great accolade to achieve that with the OECD. I hope next week we get good news from the ECOFIN meeting. All this last year we've had lots of work going on to do with anti-money laundering and terrorism financing with Moneyval, and I hope that leads to something positive. In the background though, we've got more pressure because this island has got to make sure that everybody understands that we've got real business being carried out here by people who live on the island, and that's the challenge we've got for coming couple of years, to make sure that everybody understands that we have a diversified economy, and the island is a place where people live, people work, people do business from. We're an international business centre, and that's the new challenge we've got, but we're well up for it because we are a diversified economy with lots of real business.
That drop in GDP in 32 years. It sounds a bit alarming, as if the brakes have been put on. But so how alarmed should we be?
Well, we do our GDP, our national income, from income tax data, and income tax data is income earned by companies and by people, and the amount of GDP earned by people went up last year in real terms, as it did the year before and as it did the year before that, and that's what very much matters to everybody in the Isle of Man, because most people get most of their income from working. Company income went down, and that was the reason the overall GDP went down. Company income is valuable as well, because that creates confidence.
Why did it go down?
Because we had a little bit of downturn in the e-gaming sector because of some changes in tax.
That's worrying, isn't it? Aren't we building our hopes on the e-gaming sector?
We've got a massively successful e-gaming sector, and all sectors change. Last year there was a change in the way that countries around us treated activity and sales in e-gaming. We are dealing with it. We've dealt with it. I'm not sure whether this last year's GDP will go up again, but I'm absolutely sure that the downturn will turn around eventually. But the most important thing is we need confidence in people who live here, in people who work here, and in businesses that are located here, because from confidence comes investment in businesses and in themselves and in houses, and that can't be anything but good for the island.
But can you tell if this downturn with e-gaming is a blip, or it's the beginning of something worse?
Well, there's lots of signs that there is buoyancy in the economy. So employment is up. It went down for a few years. It's gone up. Incomes are up, as I've said. Businesses are being registered here. Population declined slightly between 2013 and 2016, but now seems to be going up again. So this government has a policy inside its programme for government to make sure that we build on what's good and face head-on the challenges that we've got.
So it's wait and see as far as e-gaming is concerned?
Well, e-gaming, we haven't got any massive problems in e-gaming. It's still 17% of our income. It's
but
still
it is going the wrong direction.
It's a huge sector. There were small issues with shipping as well. I know, that's a very important sector as well. Insurance, this now is bigger than e-gaming in our national income. We've got lots and lots and lots of sectors here, lots of people with good jobs. We've got to get more good jobs for more people, and even the domestic economy can then gather confidence, and we'll see success there as well.
David Cretney, elected 7 times during that period. Yeah. How does this period compare to the feeling of the people, the grassroots, etc.? Do they feel confident about the future, or what?
Well, I've not faced an election since 2000.
But you talk to people.
I do.
And they talk to you?
Of course they do. And people are unhappy about certain things, but I think in terms of the economy, in terms of the diversified economy, that's been our strength for a long time. If you look at other places, if you look at the Channel Islands, they've been too dependent on certain sectors, whereas we've gone out of our way to diversify the economy from tourism. Tourism and farming used to be the predominant industries. We realised, or those who went before us realised, that we needed to redevelop and to look at new areas. That's been done successfully. The present government needs to continue that work, and I'm sure they will do.
Obviously, it was your first portfolio when you came in as tourism minister. Did you at that stage look ahead and think, I'm in a business which is declining, we need to do something about this?
No, I felt that at that stage...
Because you argued against it, didn't you? Because you had to, you were tourism minister.
Yeah, well, I felt at that stage that we were in a business that had gone through the worst, and that there were opportunities for the Isle of Man. I'm still optimistic that there are real opportunities for the Isle of Man in tourism. We've got a wonderful place here. We've got a safe place. The quality of life is wonderful here. There's been a number of entrepreneurs. If you look at Kieran Tasker, for example, who was recently awarded, the government awarded the Awards for Excellence in terms of his business, adventurous experiences, all those kind of things, and then staying on a farm, the countryside. There's so much here, the history, sport. We've got a real good offering, and we need to make sure that we continue to promote it.
Being a politician's a bit of an adventurous business at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it can be. Yeah,
you can find yourself suddenly dunked in the sea, rather like Kieran Tasker's orienteering, and not orienteering, is jumping off cliffs.
Yes,
co-steering. Alison Lynch, Marown. How is the feeling in Marown? You come together, obviously, as a commission. In fact, you invite MHKs. You had Rob Collister talking to you, I think, this week as well. What is the feeling of the people in Marown? Do they feel happy? Do they feel confident? Do they think things are going in the right direction?
I think they're happy with the way the local authority is run. We run very low budget. We don't do things that aren't necessary. We get things done when we're asked to do them. We try and keep costs down as much as we possibly can.
You try and do things yourself as well, rather than pass it on to one of your officers.
We do. You know, I mean, for example, if I receive a phone call or an email at home, which happens all the time, rather than passing it on to our clerk to do, I'll go straight to, for example, the people we have contracted for gullies and for hedges and for road sweeping, and ask them to do it. It just speeds things up.
If you're on the beach in Mallorca, Mallorca and places like that, and you get emails, or do you get emails there? Do you think, I need to say something about this?
I'd love to be on a beach in Mallorca, believe me, but
she'll be on the beach in Minorca.
Yeah, that's as far as I'll get.
Now, David Cretney, you're a member of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Let's just deal with a resignation that happened this week and just think about what effect it has on the party concerned. Julie Edge, the Onken MHK, has gone from Lib Van. She tabled her resignation during the week, saying she'd made the decision with regret, but in the interests of her constituents, as she was restricted from fulfilling the role properly for the people of Onken. It's been 15 months since she was elected. James Davis had a look back at her career.
Miss Edge says she thought long and hard about her position before tendering her resignation. But while she continues to uphold many of the principles and values of Lib Van policies, she feels she has to put her constituents first, highlighting a number of situations she believes are hindering her from representing the people of Onken. The final straw, she claims, was being told by the party leader, Health Minister Kate Beecroft, that she could not ask questions about health issues on the floor of the House of Keys. There's previous as far as Miss Edge's actions are concerned. South Douglas member Bill Malarkey resigned in 2008, 2 years after being elected on a Lib Van ticket, citing similar concerns. And in 2012, Zach Hall, also from Onken, was effectively sacked after he claimed there was a lack of democracy within Lib Van. Miss Edge's resignation leaves Mrs Beecroft and the Ramsey MHK Laurie Hooper as the only members of the party in Tynwald. It's yet to comment.
Let's just turn to David Cretney first of all. You're a member of the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel hemmed in by what the Labour Party... Does it tell you basically what you can and can't say?
No, not at all. I would say that the Manx Labour Party is very democratic, a very broad church. The views go from to the left to centre in terms of politics, I think.
But which view is decided upon as Labour
well,
policy?
what happens is, if you look at our last manifesto, the manifesto went out last year. We had a number of sessions on a Saturday morning over a considerable period where everybody who wished to come along from the Labour Party spent time constructing the policy document. We're an inclusive party. We're all equal.
Consensus. As far as Lib Vans is concerned, Chris Thomas. Are they still a power in Tynwald, in Keys? I mean, are people aware even of the party membership, etc., and thinking, yes, that they could be, well, they're not a block vote with just two, but that they could be influential in any decision taken?
Yeah, Kate Beecroft, Laurie Hooper, Julie Edge, they're all important politicians. Every member of the House of Keys is important. We have to remember that in the Isle of Man, any member can put down a motion about anything. Any member can look for a private member's bill. It's not like it is across, where you have to get into party lists and into groups. So every politician in the Isle of Man potentially has more power, and Laurie, Julie and Kate are amongst those politicians who do lots of work. Pretty much all of the 24 MHKs do that, I think. I'm sure, and most of the MLC. And they all have lots of power. What we have to remember as well, though, is there's a profound difference between Tynwald and Keys and other parliaments, most other parliaments. We don't have a government and an opposition bench.
Well, according to a newspaper article, they said the Isle of Man doesn't have an opposition, which painted us in rather a lurid
Which is correct, because in every other parliament you have a government bench and an opposition bench. You have a leader of opposition who gets a payment for being a leader of the opposition. We don't have that in the Isle of Man. We have a 24 MHKs that all sit next to the other person with whom they got elected in their constituency. Kate Beecroft doesn't sit next to Julie Edge and Laurie Hooper. How strange is that? You would have thought if it was a party like anywhere else, everybody in the party would be sitting next to each other, egging each other on. And so it's a very different situation, our parliament.
Alison, do you think that there should be a party system in the Isle of Man, or do you think the independent system that we have at the moment operates adequately?
Personally, I feel that the way it operates now is good. I take my hat off to Julie Edge that she's standing by what her constituents want and not by what Liberal Vannin want her to do. And I know there's been call for her to stand down as an MHK and for it to go to election. I don't believe that's necessary, because I actually believe that she would, if she did stand down, or was forced to stand down, she would get back in on election. People voted for her views, and she is standing by her constituents.
We're going to go to an ad break. Can I just read something that's come in? I'm not quite sure what it's apropos of. It says, and I'll just quote it, "It just happens to be too expensive to travel to the Isle of Man. When are these, well, they use a word here beginning with D and ending N, politicians going to realise this?" Not quite sure where that comes from, but while we have this ad break, we'll think about the answer.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Yes, you listen to Present Politics. My guests in the studio, Alison Lynch from Marown Commissioners, Chris Thomas, the Policy and Reform Minister, and MLC David Cretney, who this one I think was, no, it's to all of you, talking about expensive travelling to the island. And Dave sent another email saying tourism, which it was. That's always going to be the bugbear, isn't it?
I would say, first of all, in terms of you look at flights to the Isle of Man, it's much more competitive now than has been in a long time. The costs for leisure travellers to the Isle of Man and business travel, indeed, is much better than it ever used to be. In terms of the steam packet, you've got one provider, and the Isle of Man government is in discussion with the steam packet about the future. And obviously, I'm not involved in that, but I would have thought that the price of fares for passengers would be an important part of that discussion.
It was interesting, wasn't it? You always think the closer you get to a flight, it should be the less the flight is, but it works the other way around. And also, I think the steam packet could do with advertising a Wi-Fi free area, so you can get on the steam packet and know for about 4 hours you're not going to be attacked by anybody on the phone. Good afternoon. How can they say we have a good quality of life as this island when we have food banks? Pensioners feel like we're a liability to this island. Politicians need to get a grip with the real world at the moment. They couldn't organise a party in a brewery. Comes from Kay. I'm just going to move on to that subject, but first I want to move on to Meals on Wheels, which of course at the moment is very much a talking point. The Douglas MHK David Ashford has been pressing the Health Minister, Kate Beecroft, on plans to appoint a new provider, how the decision meets the strategy of allowing people to live in their own homes for longer. It costs about £150,000 is going to be saved by this. Mr Ashford says he has real concerns on this issue.
I think it's very important. I mean, obviously, food is part of our everyday lives. We have to eat in order to exist. And I think it is important that, particularly with the more vulnerable people out in the community who rely on this service, that their nutrition is not compromised. I do not want to see a situation where you've got people who are going without meals or feel that they can't afford meals or they don't know how to access the service. I can see what the Minister's saying about the department being more of a facilitator than a provider. I can understand that, but we've got to make sure that the balance is right.
David Ashford, at the same time, talking about meals, a food bank hub has been officially opened in the north of the island this week. Volunteers based on the Church of the Rock in Ramsey. Just put this point and just sort of throw it around a bit. surely we've always had problems. People who didn't have enough to eat, etc., gone back, I suppose, in the 50s when the island really was struggling in its economy. But in those days, it was handled in a slightly different way. I suppose neighbours kept an eye on neighbours. The community kept an eye on the community. Then there was this long period when the government basically took over a lot of things. And now that the government is trying to cut back on those things, David Cretney, everyone is saying, well, why are they doing that? Isn't there enough will in the community to look after its own, if I can put it that way?
I think the community is different now than it was then. I regret some of the moves, and I've been vocal about some of the moves that government is proposing at the moment. I welcome David Ashford asking that in the House of Keys. The morning after Mrs. Beecroft's department announced the Meals on Wheels thing, the Manx Labour Party issued a statement, and the statement was to the effect that if we're expecting more people to live longer in their own homes, which is a good thing, then surely for the future there's going to be more need for these kind of services, because with Meals on Wheels not only do they provide the meals, but also there's somebody there to make sure that the people the vulnerable people, the over 200 vulnerable people who the health department are aware of, are visited from time to time to make sure they're all right as well.
Just like to move to Alison in a moment, but just keeping with you, Mr. Cretney, 877,000 it costs to give the over 75s their TV licences, I think. So you were one of the people that got this back again, etc. Is there an argument basically for extending the life, say, making it 78-year-olds, 79-year-olds get TV licences and using the money saved to go to Meals on Wheels?
No, the argument with that is that the Isle of Man should be treated exactly the same as the Channel Islands and the United Kingdom, and that is that the BBC has an agreement which is a tapering agreement whereby they will take on the responsibility for persons over 75 in terms of the payment of the TV licences. I think it's 3 years. And the Isle of Man government has obviously, unfortunately, been lumbered with the previous government, in my opinion, made a wrong arrangement, and they've now got to try and correct that if they can.
Alison, your area is a rural area. You've got, I think, 22% people over 60. It's a sort of community where people can get forgotten. They're living in rural areas, etc. I suppose you as commissioners have to make sure that they don't get forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, we, as commissioners, we don't own any social housing. At the moment, we fall under Douglas. I would hope that the community of Marown rally round each other. We look after our neighbours. We make sure that our neighbours are...
But do you have a tick list of boxes of all the houses and make sure that a visit is made just to assess the situation? I suppose there's some people who would not welcome that. They think, I can get on perfectly well by myself.
There are probably people who wouldn't want anybody visiting. When we have spells of bad weather, for example, when we're, snowing or flooding, we put out onto our website, onto social media, onto Twitter, Facebook, please make sure that your neighbours are okay. It doesn't take much to knock on somebody's door, even if they don't want to see you.
That's a rural area. David Cretney, yours is a very built-up area, but the same thing can happen, I suppose. People can get lost inside a tight community.
Yes, I've done exactly the same via Facebook in the past. When we've had periods of cold weather, it costs nothing, and perhaps a couple of minutes just to knock on a neighbour's door. If it's an elderly person, for example, on their own, it's exactly the right thing to do, and I've always tried to encourage that to happen.
Just move on to a subject about local authorities and the debate that's going on. David Ashford tried to raise it and was told, no, not now, David, sit down. And then he says, well, I'll raise it again in November next year and November. Let me just read this from one of our listeners. I see there's been a recent consultation about local authorities undertaken by the DOI. Let me see what it says here. Do the panel have any views on the following? And he gives a series. Is it acceptable for a local authority member to hold office while having a rates debate to the authority they serve on? And should there be provision within legislation that allows for the removal from office of a local authority member who misleads their authority or bullies fellow members or staff? I don't know if that is referring to a specific instance. It seems to be a fairly general thing. There's sort of querulous looks on the faces of my panel here. Not quite sure which direction that's coming from. Any views on it? Anyone on that?
Well, from a Marown point of view, no, I can't.
Yeah. So you can't see really. Oh, sorry, yeah, Chris Thomas.
So the law will be changed. That's what the consultation is about. And of course, commissioners, like any other politicians, can't go around bullying anybody, and they can't go around misleading anybody. So there's two things I want to bring on top of the legal aspect. The first one is that the Tynwald Commissioner for Administration, an ombudsman system, a complaint system, will come into force for local authorities, like it will for departments of government, but slightly later for local authorities. So having a pilot beginning on the 31st of December this year for all of government, and it will be in place for local authorities quite soon. So that will help if there are allegations.
So an ombudsman will be a person people can take their complaints to if they feel
once it's gone through the internal complaint procedure of the local authority, it will become available for people outside local authorities against local authorities through a system that's already in place in law through the Tynwald Commissioner of Administration Act. And the second thing is that last year we extended the standing orders and the purview of the Tynwald member standards to include a sort of bullying of commissioners by members of Tynwald, because there were allegations along that sort of line as well. So we've got lots going. It was alleged it went on, and I took it. I was quite involved because at the time I was the person in the Department of Infrastructure responsible for local administration, and it's only a member of Tynwald that can begin a proceeding against a fellow member. Pretty much inside the Tynwald process, so I took that on. I never actually made it formally, but
we've seen that in the last few years, or accusations of that, obviously, in the House of Keys in the last administration. Just a comment here about travel, by the way. Cheaper to go to the continent for a fortnight from England than come over here for a fortnight. No, but yeah, and that's the comments we usually get, isn't it? I suppose
it is. If we just go back to the subject we were talking about, I wonder if it refers to the petition that Ray Hamilton put before Tynwald, whereby there was issues in Onken in terms of the local authority commissioners and in government. When I was Minister for Infrastructure, we made a decision that the same rules that applied for Tynwald members would apply to local authority members, and I think Ray Harm was putting that through at the moment.
That's it. Yeah, that's the consultation. The consultation is the final stages before that bill comes into both branches of Tynwald next year.
We're going to take a break. Before we go, let's just put this in front of you. This is about the silo mentality that Chris Robertshaw likes to talk about quite a bit, and I think most people accept that there is a bit of a silo mentality in the various government departments. It's also tied in with the Vision 9 fiasco, which basically Mr. Robertshaw says was probably the result of that, not individuals. He says it was right to abandon the deal. The public felt uncomfortable with how the affair had been handled. He's placing the blame on individual risks, missing the bigger picture, as he puts it.
I do hope that at the end of all this we don't end up making the current Minister of DED the scapegoat, because if we do that, we've completely missed the point.
OK, but should those responsible survive? The report submitted to the Council of Ministers clearly points the finger at the Minister and the former Chief Executive, Chris Corlett, who left his post last Christmas.
It also says something else, which is very important, and I think I need to focus on that, and that is that the collaborative capacity across government is inadequate, number one, and number two, in terms of strategic, big-ticket thinking, we have inadequate resource.
We'll just talk about that. The DED now, of course, is now let me work it out, DFE, the Department for Enterprise. We'll talk about that in a moment. Just before we go on to the subject, we're talking about the single entity. This has come in from Jane Mellon, wife of Neil Mellon, director of the Isle of Man Food Bank. The Northern Hub, we were talking about this food bank, is just part of Island-wide Food Bank, who signpost those in need to the relevant departments, government departments and other agencies to find longer-term solutions, as well as supplying food, education and equipment to those in crisis. So it's not just a question, David Cretney, of sort of coming along and handing out food to people and saying...
Well, I heard...
Well, that's the start of the process.
I'm sure the other members of the panel did as well, but I heard Neil Mellon speaking on the week, and he said how the demand had doubled more or less each year, and I think it was up to 800 most recently. That's really unfortunate.
That's discounting the people who would not want to be seen coming forward.
Yes, absolutely. It's just a very serious subject, and it's something that we need to make sure that we support the third sector in doing what they're doing, and try and eliminate the causes of it as well, because it's not something I'm happy with. When I was first elected, that people used to talk about soup kitchens and things and how they were given vouchers for meals and things. We really shouldn't be in that position in a modern democracy.
Just returning to the single entity thing, Chris Thomas, it's a bit like a football team, isn't it, with everybody playing their own game, etc. The government needs to play as a team, and although over the years people have said this is what's necessary, yes, it's going to happen, it doesn't seem to have happened yet, and this Vision 9 business seemed to be a case in point where the poor old DED, as they were then, were left on their own basically to sort this out, and if they'd been able to ask everybody, perhaps they would have got a better picture of the way forward. Am I right in saying that?
I think you are. We have to remember the Vision 9 episode was 18 months ago. One of the first things the new government did was stop that process. And I'm not saying that everything that Chris Robertshaw says is right, but in this case, I believe Chris Robertshaw to be right. So it wasn't only that the fault in DED; it was also the fault of the other departments, and that Council of Ministers has to take responsibility for that to some extent, because it is shocking for me to learn from this report that infrastructure and home affairs, health and social care, the other departments involved, didn't know what was going on until they found out later on what was going on. I'm very interested to learn more from David in coming months before we have that very important debate in January, but there certainly is a single legal entity, a working together, silo mentality, cross-government working aspect to all this. It's not just as simple as it was all Lawrence Skelly's fault.
When you're dealing, Alison Lynch from Marown, with the government, do you come across this business of having to cross boundaries to go from one department to the other if you want something achieved?
No. We're very lucky. For example, we have great relationship with the DOI. It takes a phone call. It takes.
Well, he's a local minister now, or virtually a local minister, isn't he? And on your doorstep, so yes. You know him well.
Yes, and we do have good relationships, and I must say that since some of the services have moved from central government to local government, for example, hedge cutting, road sweeping, gully emptying, etc., we've been able to manage those a lot better, and it's taken the pressure off also. It's taken the pressure off government departments because we can do it ourselves.
Can I just ask you, how do you do that? Because I know around St Mark's there's a lady inside a tractor who was doing all the hedging and cut back all the hedges, and I stopped and had a word with her. Is it sort of contracted out?
Yeah, we go out to tender. We put a tender. We do.
So who
tender
does it?
Process.
Local farmers or what?
Local businesses. For example, our waste collection is done by Kinraids. Our hedge cutting and gully emptying is done by Mr. Jones. And we go out to tender every 3 or 5 years.
This is going back a bit, going back decades, David Cretney, isn't it, to where the community actually does what's necessary rather than relying on the government.
Well, I think this is a very important issue, that government should concentrate on the big issues, and there should be more devolved to local authorities of the lower level, but equally very important duties. So I'm very supportive of what's happened. Another area, if you look at DOI, and I've heard things in the last week which made me happier, but if you look at the DOI, obviously the important thing to them is the main infrastructure of the roads. But in terms of the Isle of Man and tourism, the footpath network, the green lanes, all those kind of things are equally very important for tourism. And so they're not top of the list in terms of priority for DOI because they've got bigger fish to fry. So the nice thing was that I heard that, again, the third sector, Bill Dale and Beach Buddies are talking about getting involved in that. And I think that's really good. It's really positive news.
Is it possible for areas to organise their own pothole filling? The DOI does it, but yeah. Obviously you've got things like health and safety. It's got to be done properly, otherwise it could even add to the mess. But is it possible, like they do hedge cutting, to fill in potholes? Possibly.
There used to be gangs around the island who knew where the issues were and would be straight on to the issues. The DOI, to be fair, does have an app which is very they do quickly respond to
But would it be
potholes.
better if the locals who knew those places could deal with it
A
themselves?
cooperation between both, I would suggest.
Alison Lynch, just going to Chris Thomas in a moment. Alison Lynch, would that be possible in your
I
area?
agree with what David has said. The problems that arise from that are, for example, if we were to take on pavement repairs, for example, they have to be done absolutely so accurately, within millimetres, that if a local authority was to do it, or
It's a specialist business.
Yes, yeah, because unfortunately we're in the culture of, I'll trip on that pavement and I'll sue. Well, who then becomes responsible for it? But
I suppose you could put big notice in the borders of Marown commissioners saying anybody who trips on a pavement here, you're on your own.
You wouldn't get away with it.
You wouldn't know.
No,
You'd have to follow it up. Chris Thomas.
We've got a rates modernisation process about to begin. We've got local authority reform, and I think there's much more in common between David Ashford and Minister Harmer than there is difference between them. I think both of them are united by the fact that we've got to take into account the questions just raised by Alison to do with quality and standards. But most importantly, we've got to get efficiency in housing, in waste management, in pothole repair, in keeping the footpaths open, in hedge trimming. And I really do think in the next 12 months we're going to have a lot of activity in that, and we'll come up with a better solution.
Yeah, you're nodding your head, David Cretney. You agree with that?
I do agree with that, yes.
This comes in from James. Do the panel agree that no more council rent increases should be imposed before there is proper means testing? Rents have gone up massively over the last few years and incomes have not. We were promised means testing years ago by Mr. Chris Robert Shaw, when he was in charge of housing. Stop hitting those who can least afford it. The people have had enough of you pampering to the rich while ignoring the rest of us. Still that, in some quarters, still that picture, isn't there, Chris Thomas?
Hi, James. We've talked about this over 3 or 4 years. Let's remember, the first thing this month, I'd say the most important thing this month in Manx politics is we went from economic growth for its own sake to what we call useful growth or inclusive growth. We've got to look after the person in the middle. So therefore, James is right that we've got to make sure that housing stays affordable for everybody. I don't think this year it's going to be a year of high rents, like it wasn't high rent increases, like it wasn't last year or the year before or the year before that. I don't think that there's going to be a means testing system to give benefits to people in the situation just above current benefits for a number of years. But the other point I think somebody like James would like to hear is we have to remember what Minister Cannon said in the budget last year, which is we are asking richer people to pay more. So for instance, last year Minister Cannon announced that the tax cap was going up by 25,000 this year, another 25,000 next year, and 25,000 the year after that. So we've got to get this society and this economy working for everybody, and James makes an important point, which is housing has got to be affordable for people who are just above benefits.
Presumably, just getting back to Brexit, we have to be wary, because if we're relying on expensive people to actually come over to the island and pay us quite a bit of money, we have to be aware of the fact that they could not want to be in somewhere that's outside the EU.
You put in another massive topic there if it was for me, John. And
I understand they're building in the Bulls Bridge area of Dublin, they're building massive offices in preparation for people leaving the UK to go and work inside the EU in Dublin.
And Brexit is massively important. Everything international is massively important, but politicians can't afford to neglect attention to our own economy. We've got dark skies around us internationally, but we've also got dark skies around us because earnings haven't been going up in the last few years. On the other hand, prices have been going up, and this politician, for one, and I know my colleagues, are absolutely adamant that that's of primary importance, and we've got to have policies, real policies, that really do something about it.
This is an interesting one. As there is an expectation the island should mirror services that other countries provide, should we also have a graduated income tax system? I mean, we sort of have it's 10% and 20% at the moment, and of course you've got the tax cap. But presumably a graduated tax system, I'm not familiar with it, has a lot more tiers to it.
No, I'd say we do have a progressive income tax until you get very rich. So I think that we have a 10%, we have a 20%. We pay more of our income tax than in most societies as people rather than as companies. But the other point is we do have a reasonable large amount of indirect taxes and charges, and they obviously bear down on poorer people, and we've got to make sure that we are cognizant of that when we set our public revenue policy. Very rich people in the Isle of Man on average pay about 3% tax, but they are very wealthy and they are paying £150,000 worth of tax, which is quite a lot of money in my book.
Let's just go to someone in our studio, one of our guests, who says he would happily take on a role, which not often, when they appoint committees and things in Keys and Tynwald, generally see people shrinking back and things like that. But David Cretney says he would be happy to take on the role of an elderly champion, insists the most important aspect in having someone to proactively champion the cause of the elderly and raise any concerns as their rights. Let's just hear what you said, Mr. Cretney, when you agreed to that.
More people, fortunately, are living longer, but with that come a number of issues which need representation, need discussion. I do believe, given the importance of a number of issues, and there have already been certain things that have taken place. For example, if you talk about the proposal in relation to prescriptions, which would place us in the worst position in the British Isles, then we've had the removal of the subsidy towards Meals on Wheels from January.
Mr. Cretney, would you see an elderly champion's role as being a formal role, being sort of with the law behind it, or would it be an informal role, or what?
Well, we already have champions in Tynwald. We have a champion for young people, we have a champion for diversity and equality, and I see it on the same basis as that. And I just wanted to respond to what Chris was saying a moment ago about local authority means testing for housing. I can't see how, if some people say, lots of old people are wealthy and they don't need this support. And yet we're going forward with a proposal to place us in the worst position in the British Isles in terms of prescription charges without either means testing or needs testing in place. And I made that point to the consultation. I do hope they take that on board. And again, I think the response in Tynwald was, well, there is somebody in social care within the department who looks after the needs of the elderly. Well, if that is the case, then how did that proposal get legs?
So what sort of power would you have as a champion?
Well, and let me just say, I believe that a person responsible for this is across departments rather than just in one department, because there are issues in a number of different areas which are affecting older people, just as there are issues affecting younger people, for which there is a champion. And I hope that the Minister, Chief Minister and the Council Ministers will be prepared to reconsider this.
What about putting it on the lines of, say, an elderly ombudsman?
Well, the ombudsman will be able to look at a number of areas
but
anyway.
Someone specifically looking at the over a certain age, etc.
Yes, I want the thing to be properly looked at. I want the ability, either myself or somebody else, on behalf of those people who've served this island well over an extended period, who've paid their taxes, who've paid their NI for years and years, and now a number of them feel they're getting the wrong end of the stick. And all I'm saying is, let's just have somebody who can support them, just as we are with the young people, just as we are with diversity and equality.
Just talking about figures, the prescription charges, I think across, isn't it £8, over £8 in the UK, but here we've not reached that level, sure. Yeah, we said we were higher than we were.
No, what happens is that at a certain age it remains free of charge in the United Kingdom. But what's being proposed here is that there will be a charge for people over 65.
Alison, Lynch, Marown Commissioners, would you applaud a champion for the elderly?
Definitely. I think, we need to look after the ageing population as well as the younger people coming through. But means testing, I'm a great believer that we need means testing.
In all areas?
Possibly in all areas, definitely in housing. There's a lot of the older generation still living in their own homes, struggling on their state pension, but still managing to live in their own home, with the cost of living increasing year after year after year, their pension not increasing year after year, but they still manage to live in their own home. You have other people living in subsidised housing, who are so comfortable it's untrue, and should, at a time of life when somebody in subsidised housing needs to go into a nursing home, for example, who pays for it? The government.
When are we going to get round to this? Because there seems to be a general appreciation of the fact, Chris Thomas, that some sort of means testing is appropriate.
Yeah. So many issues came up in those previous two comments, very helpful ones. The first point to respond is that we will have a means testing policy available, I believe, within 3 months. I've got a group of officers across departments trying to put together all the different policies and aspirations in different areas, and we will be able to make a statement about means testing. And it is much more complicated than it first seems, not because of some of the simple issues and problems that have been identified in the past, but very basic issues to do with computer systems that exist and how things are done. But I think we will have a clear statement within 3 months. In terms of the issue that Alison just raised about people inside public sector housing, commissioners' housing, people will remember that we put in place 5-year fixed-term tenancies about 4 years ago. 30% of people in public sector housing are now on those tenancies, and the first of those will come up to renewal in shortly. And the Department of Infrastructure will be consulting on access and eligibility criteria, taking into account financial circumstances more in coming months. And I believe the Minister will be making policy announcements early in the new year. And then picking up on David's point about an older person's champion, of course it's right that the issues of being elderly and poverty and when you're elderly are important. I challenge David as chair of the Social Affairs Policy Review Committee to work in that space as that chair, because as chair of the Social Affairs Policy Review Committee of Tynwald, you can do a lot. We can do a lot in government. I'm trying to across government. There are differences between looking after people who are elderly and people who have disabilities and children, because people who have disabilities and people and children...
We're going to have to issue that challenge for after the news, unfortunately. We're just coming up there. But that challenge has been issued. We shall hear the answer, because all three of my guests, I'm glad to say, are staying on, Alison, Lynch, Chris Thomas and David Cretney, for the session with the Man in Line, which will come after the news. But we've now arrived at 1 o'clock.